Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place where we learn about fun things and we talk to some great people along the way. I'm really excited for my guest today. He's a good friend of mine. We used to work together in a couple of different ways, and I'm really excited that he's here. My guest today is Scott Addie. Scott, do you want to say hello, introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi Isaac. Thanks
Yeah,
for having
hi
me on the
Isaac.
show.
Thanks for
So
having
I'm
me on the
for those that
show.
don't know, I'm
So
Scott
I'm
Addie,
for
one
those
of
that don't
many
know, I'm
Scotts
Scott
at
Addie, one of
Microsoft.
many Scotts at
If you ever
Microsoft.
get confused as
If
to
you
which one
ever
I
get
am, just look at the
confused as to
bottom of
which
the
one I
list
am,
totem
just look at
pole.
the
That's
bottom
me
of
right
the
there.
totem pole.
I don't
That's me
know.
right
So
there.
yeah, Isaac mentioned
So yeah,
I've worked with
Isaac
him
mentioned
several
I've
times.
worked with him
We were
several
actually talking
times.
about this in the
We were
pre-show,
actually
weren't
talking
we?
about
About
this in the
Yeah.
our
pre-show,
days at
weren't
a
we? About
fine
our days
insurance
at
company
a fine
near where I
insurance
live right
company
now.
Yeah.
near where I live
I
right
mean, I don't know
now.
if Scott, your joke is always like, I'm the lesser Scott, blah, 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 right? I think a lot of people really appreciate the work that you do. So I think you're giving yourself a little bit, you're not giving yourself enough credit. But anyway, that's beside the point. So one of the things I love to chat about with people when they come on the show is, you know, how people got started. So, do you remember a time like in your early life, whether you could have been a kid or even if you're older, like going to high school or college, and you came across tech in general, and you're like, "Oh, this is something that I want to do the rest of my life."
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would
Yeah,
say,
that's a good question. So I would
thinking
say,
back,
thinking
I'd say
back, I
8
was
years old.
probably, I'd say
And I
8
would
years
say I
old.
was forced
And I would
into
say I
tech
was forced
in sort
into
of a
tech
non-traditional
in
way. And
sort
what I
of a
mean by that
non-traditional
is
way. And what I mean by that
my
is,
parents had purchased
uh,
an Apple
my parents
IIc
had purchased
Plus,
an Apple
which I think
IIc
was
Plus,
released
which
probably
I
in the
think
late
was
80s.
released probably in the late
So I'm
80s.
dating myself here, but
So I'm
Fair.
dating myself
they
here, but
they provided this Apple
they
IIc
they
Plus
provided this
under
Apple
one
IIc
condition.
Plus
You are
under
not
one
to
condition: you
do
are
anything
not
really fun on
to
here.
do anything really fun
The
on
idea here
here.
is you're going to
The
practice your
idea
math
here is you're going to
skills.
practice your
And
math
so I
skills.
would sit down,
And so
put in
I would
this
sit down,
three and a
put
half
in
inch
this
disc that
three and a
contained
half inch
this
disc that
game called
contained
Math
this
Blasters.
game called
And
Math
I remember I
Blasters.
was,
And I remember
practicing
I
my
was,
addition,
practicing my
subtraction, just
addition,
fundamentals
subtraction,
in
just
mathematics.
fundamentals in
And in
mathematics.
doing that, I was,
And in doing
my
that, I
parents would
was,
leave the room and I'd
my
mess
parents would
around
leave
with the
the room and
computer,
I'd mess
exactly
around
what I
with the
was told not
computer,
to do.
exactly what I was
And
told not to do.
it was that
And it
experience
was that
that really drew me
experience
in. And
that really
I
drew
started
me
to
in.
wonder,
And
well, how is this
I
thing
started to
actually
wonder, well,
working?
how is this thing actually
Outside of
working?
the math game that I
Outside
was
of the
playing,
math
really
game
got
that I
my
was
gears
playing,
turning.
really
What's
got my
going
gears
on that's
turning.
allowing this to
What's going
happen?
on that's allowing this to happen?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it seemed to me like you kind of started off with like I want to this interest in learning more, or and educating yourself on things that are interesting to you, and continue our education, right? I think that's something that's very, very important. Um, did you know you wanted to get, like, when you got into college, you were like, I want to do software stuff? Like, was that very much like you went down the computer science route almost immediately?
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I
so
would
I would
say
say
the
the
decision was
decision was
made in
made
high
in high
school.
school.
I had
I had
taken
taken
a
a
introductory
introductory
programming
programming
class
class
using
using
a
a
programming
programming
language called
language called
HyperCard,
HyperCard,
and it was
and it was
more of
more
a
of a
visual
visual
programming
programming
model where
model where
you
you
drag a
drag a
button
button
on
on
the
the
screen and
screen and
then
then
associate
associate
that
that
button with
button
a
with a
command. It
command.
would
It
do
would do
something.
something.
And we were
And we were
doing this
doing this
development on
development
a
on a
Mac,
Mac,
and
and
I
I
had
had
exposure to
exposure to
the
the
Mac
Mac
platform,
platform,
my
my
experience with the
experience with the
Apple
Apple
IIc
IIc
Plus.
Plus.
So
So
that
that
introductory
introductory
programming
programming
class
class
drew me
drew me
in.
in.
The
The
next
next
year, I
year,
took
I
a
took a
C++
C++
class,
class,
and I
and I
said,
said,
okay,
okay,
if this
if
is
this
what
is what
programming is, I
programming is, I
want
want
nothing to
nothing
do
to
with
do
it.
with it.
I
Sure.
I
did
did
not
not
enjoy the
enjoy the
memory
memory
management
management
aspect
aspect
of C++
of C++
at
at
all.
all.
The
The
tooling
tooling
wasn't
wasn't
great,
great,
but
but
I
I
kind
kind
of
of
told
told
myself at
myself at
that
that
point,
point,
well, but
well,
you
but
did
you did
enjoy
enjoy
that
that
other
other
Yeah.
thing you
thing you
used,
used,
HyperCard.
HyperCard.
Stick with
Stick
it
with
and
it and
see
see
what
what
other
other
aspects of
aspects of
programming there
programming there
are.
are.
And so
So
that led
that
me
led me
into
into
talking to
talking to
my
my
academic
academic
counselor at
counselor
high
at high
school.
school.
And
And
at the
at the
time, there
time,
was
there was
something
something
like
like
a
a
97%
97%
job
job
placement
placement
rate
rate
at
at
the
the
university I
university I
ended up
ended up
attending.
attending.
The
The
school that
school that
was
was
maybe
maybe
30
30
minutes
minutes
from
from
where I
where I
lived at the
lived at the
time.
time.
So I
So I
pursued
pursued
that.
that.
I
I
applied to the
applied to the
school
school
and
and
was
was
accepted.
accepted.
Very
Very
first
first
programming
programming
class
class
there was
there
a
was a
Visual
Visual
Basic
Basic
class. And
class. And
again, I
again, I
took
took
that
that
and I
and
was
I was
hooked.
hooked.
I was like, this feels a lot like my
Yeah.
high school experience with HyperCard. So let's keep going and see what else I can learn.
That's great. I think, and one of the things so a little bit of backstory with Scott and I, he was a bit more experienced and he joined a company that I was currently working at, and he was kind of a mentor slash senior developer where I was. And, we had the opportunity to work a lot together because we were on the same team. And it was the tech was all Microsoft tech. And I'm curious to know, like, what brought you to like Microsoft tech is interesting. Obviously, there's lots of different paths that people can go down from a programming perspective, but like, what was it about Microsoft tech that really made you interested? Because you've obviously stuck there. Now you work at Microsoft, right?
Yeah, great question. In short, it was the tooling.
Yeah.
That's what led me to Microsoft. So let me provide a little more context here. I mentioned in college, my very first course in the undergraduate program was in Visual Basic,
Yep.
programming wise. That led into, I would say, 3 years worth of Java. So Java programming, and it was awful. The programming was to be done in a notepad-like tool called TextPad.
Sure.
So it wasn't an IDE by any means. We were actually compiling code in the equivalent of Notepad.
Yeah.
So that being said alone, you can imagine the pain. I would say further into the program, we switched over to using Eclipse. And I was like, okay, this is a smidge better than TextPad, but it's still not great. Yeah, it leaves many things to be desired. And so what ended up happening is that I was talking to my academic counselor in my undergrad program, and I said, no, I'm really interested in pursuing a minor. What about web development? And the reason why I pursued web development was because of the interest I had earlier in my life with the web in general and how it all worked. And it was that minor in web development that led me to ASP.NET.
I see.
And I want to say it was version 1.0 or 1.1 of .NET at the time. We were building web pages in class, and that's when I was introduced to Visual Studio. So comparing Visual Studio and C# to my experience with Java and Eclipse and TextPad, I was like, okay, my mind has been made up.
Yeah.
Microsoft clearly has it figured out with regards to tooling. That's the path I'm going to take from this point forward. No more Java.
Sure. That's interesting. I think it's funny because I imagine some people that, if they watch this and they're, more maybe akin to the way Java does things, they're like, what do you mean the tooling is bad? Like, I mean, Eclipse is great or IntelliJ is great or whatever. I think that there is something to say about, especially when you're getting started as a developer, like the tools have to be like low barrier to entry. Like if the tools are hard or if the concepts are hard for you to grasp, like you're probably going to find something else. So I think there's definitely something to say about that. One thing I think is really interesting in what you said too is like, I think that there's probably an issue in some academic circles about how you should learn computer science too. Like there are obviously tools better than like TextPad, but that particular professor thought that it would be very important for you to really understand the syntactic necessities of things. Right? You can't cheat with Ender. I had a similar experience in computer science too, where it's like, yeah, write everything in Notepad and then just use a bunch of command line stuff to like build it and all that. And it's just like, I never really understood why. Never really got a good answer.
Yeah,
either.
you bring up it's a good point. Looking back on it now, it does feel like a form of gatekeeping that was going on.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember very distinctly going into my first data structures course for my computer science program. And the professor stood in front of all of the students in this auditorium. There were probably, I'd say, close to 200 students sitting there. And one thing he said was something to the effect of, at the end of this semester, 75% of you will no longer be sitting here in this classroom.
Sure.
You will have dropped out of the program.
Yeah.
And you hear
ridiculous.
something like that and you're like, what have I gotten myself into? You start to question things at that point. But I stuck with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and not to go down this rabbit hole about how some professors have like this elitism about the stuff they do because they spent their entire careers, and they grew up in an environment that wasn't, didn't have all these tools that existed to make lives easier for developers. So they want people to feel the same struggles, right? I'm not going to get into that, but I think that the one thing that I think is very interesting is like we live now where people can go not the traditional university route to get into tech, right? Most of the major companies now, they don't require 4-year degrees. There are a plethora of issues like code issues. There are a plethora of tools like for learning, like, Pluralsight, LinkedIn Learning, miscellaneous platforms for learning, provided by software vendors. Also just things like code camps, right? These things didn't exist 20 years ago, or weren't as mature as they are 20 years as they are now. So it's really interesting to see like the gatekeeping that you're talking about. It's still there, but it's not because of tools anymore. It's because of culture and, unfortunately, to an effect, like communities, right?
And I would say I really do appreciate the fact that now some companies are sort of lowering that barrier to entry.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need that degree now. Where I'm going with this is, thinking back on previous companies I've worked, previous jobs, some of the most innovative, intelligent software developers I've ever worked with never went to school.
Yeah.
They were self-taught. No coding boot camps, no Pluralsight. They learned it all on their own before that. They were the people that were going out to Borders when that was a thing.
Yeah.
You could go out and buy paper books. Or they go out to Barnes and Nobles, they get the latest programming book off the shelf and just focus on that for hours at a time. And again, it's something I feel like the industry has come a long way in that regard, just recognizing the fact that you are capable of doing the job, probably, if you don't have that degree. It's more about how ambitious are you? What kind of drive do you have?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of motivation required to learn anything that's kind of not directly in your face all the time. But especially, I've talked about this a lot about in tech in general, is that to be like in tech or to be a software developer, you need to have like a little bit of like masochism like built in. Like you need to be able to enjoy a little bit of pain because the reward is so valuable, or so the reward is so rewarding. That's not really a great sentence, but it's interesting because I tell people, when people ask me, how do you get started in tech or how do you get started working at company X? And I'm like, well, you have to be okay with like things going wrong like 95% of the time. And like the 5% is what you live for.
Yeah. And I would say a lot of success is based on, I would say being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
Knowing the right people.
Yep.
I wouldn't be at Microsoft without a little bit of luck.
Yeah.
On my side.
Yeah. No, I think everybody kind of, I don't believe in a world that's completely built on just people's hard work. I don't believe in that. Like people fall face up all the time. I love saying that. Like there's so many opportunities where people will be doing something and then something magical will come across their plate and you're just like, okay, well that's what I want to do. Like my origin story for a lot of this stuff, for the fact that I love open source work, the fact that I used to work at Microsoft, was because I went to Microsoft Build X amount of years ago, and I had a conversation with one Scott Addie, and he was talking about how great all this stuff was, and he was a Microsoft MVP and doing all these cool things. And I was like, wow, I've been kind of not doing any of these things for like a long time in my professional career. And I thought at that point in time, it was a good opportunity to kind of give back and start to be more involved with the developer community instead of just being somebody who just wrote code from 9 to 5 and went home.
And I remember that conversation. We were sitting in the front row of one of the sessions.
Yeah.
Isaac sat down next to me, and he was wearing a suit. And I thought to myself, who is this guy?
Yeah.
He must be unemployed.
Oh, geez. Okay.
What developer wears a suit?
Was I
But
wearing
yeah,
a
we
suit?
did have this
Oh, man. Okay.
this conversation about, how are things going at Microsoft. At the time, I was working on the content development team supporting ASP.NET Core.
Yep.
And to be honest, it was a fantastic experience. So I was, feeding Isaac all of these, reasons why he should join. I think, I forget what company you were with at the time. Was it Accenture or?
Yeah, it wasn't Accenture, but it was like a consulting company. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a great conversation, and it led me to, I think, the first open source thing that I did, which is funny enough, is I wrote a doc on docs.microsoft.com from migrating .NET Framework to .NET Core at the time. I think it was like 2.0 or 2.1. And that was like the first thing that I had done that wasn't like tech related, that wasn't for my job. Like I'd never done like side projects or built packages or anything. So it was like the first thing that I actually had done that wasn't work related in tech, and I got the bug from there. So if everybody is complaining about having to deal with me in general, like you can blame Scott for it, for sure. One thing that you said that I think is really interesting when we were talking about it is with docs, right? Like a lot of people probably are, know you as one of the people that were on the .NET Docs team, right? And I think one of the things that's really interesting about that team is, one, it's way smaller than you think. And two, like you're kind of open source maintainers for a project, right?
Yeah, you're 100% correct. When I would tell people just how small that content development team was, they were like, "You're kidding me, right?"
Yeah.
And I said, "No, there are seriously like 3 people, including myself, on that team. 4 if you count the contractor that we use on occasion to scale our efforts." But so that 3-person team was responsible for ASP.NET 4.x, ASP.NET Core, Entity Framework 6, Entity Framework Core, C#, VB, F#. The list goes on and on.
Yeah, and I know that one of the things that I had right when I started to get into contributing to Docs was, it hasn't been on Docs forever, right? So there was this huge effort to move all of the existing documentation from one platform to another. And doing that, I could only imagine how difficult it was for the people who were doing it. But also, it was this forced in the open, right? Because, there is a GitHub repo for Docs. It's changed a few times, but it's always been in the open since the decision was made to put things on GitHub. And I just think it's been very, very interesting watching that journey go from like very immature handling of open source stuff to like what it is now, where you can go to the page, you can click edit, and it opens up an issue for you immediately, right?
Yeah, and I think, the importance, particularly with the .NET community, of having open source docs is that's what customers have come to expect with the product itself.
Yeah.
They see that sausage being made. And so, they want all of the planning to happen out in the open. They want to be able to contribute fixes when they see a problem. The docs should follow suit, and they certainly did. We had, I think, on average on the ASP.NET Core docs, probably 30 community contributors per month. In some cases, giving us complete documents, complete articles for brand new pieces of tech that we just didn't have a chance to get to.
Yeah.
So it really helped us scale our efforts. And a lot of those folks' contributions were so significant that they would later earn MVP awards for their contributions.
Yeah, and maybe for the people who aren't aware, like the Microsoft MVP award program is basically, it's a community award which showcases like the best of the best for people that are, in the .NET or the Microsoft community that are doing great work. Most of the other major companies have things like this. Like Google has a developer expert, I think it's called. AWS has something called Heroes. There's, Docker has something called, I think, Docker Captains. But this idea of like, rewarding community members in meaningful ways, and that's how Microsoft does it, right? And there's all sorts of cool things that you get. You get closer access to people like Scott, who works in the product group at Microsoft, and you just build this. Again, it's just about building these communities of people that have very similar interests, right?
Yeah, and I would say that open source contribution model really played a huge role in, my getting into Microsoft
Sure.
and working on that docs team. So if I kind of take a step back, the year was 2015. Let's start there. And I was working in a financial services organization as a software architect, overseeing a development team of about 85 people. And I was the person that was determining the technology that was to be used on new development.
Sure.
ASP.NET Core was one of those things that I had decided we are going to use this. We're a Microsoft shop.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, we were heavily invested in web forms, not yet even using MVC.
Yeah.
So I was like, I really see ASP.NET Core as where we need to go, and here are the reasons why.
Yep.
And so as I was starting to learn more about ASP.NET Core, I was reading through the documentation on docs.microsoft.com, and I was finding gaps, things that I felt should be explained better or things that weren't explained at all.
Sure.
And as I was teaching myself those concepts, I was trying to fill those gaps in the documentation. And so through doing that, I had to learn Git.
Yeah.
And for me, that was a scary experience. I was coming from an environment where we were using Team Foundation version control.
Yeah.
This Git thing was completely new to me. And I've lost count of how many times I've made a fool out of myself in public on GitHub because I have no idea what things like squash mean
Yeah.
or what head means. All this new terminology I'm exposed to in a different source control model.
Yep.
Eventually, I was able to get over that barrier and contribute more and more to the official documentation. One of the cool things the team was doing at the time is they were adding author bylines to articles that were contributed by a community member, or if there were significant updates made. And I remember the first time my name was added to that author byline on one of the docs.
Yeah.
There was a conversation that next week at work. A developer stopped by my desk and said, "Hey, Scott, I've been reading about this ASP.NET Core thing you're trying to roll out across the department. And I saw your name on the docs.
Yeah.
Is that really you?"
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, that's me. It's kind of cool that you found that. But it was motivation to keep going.
Yeah.
And, in contributing through open source, I made all sorts of connections with people I would later work with at Microsoft. Shane Boyer being one of those people. I remember Shane was working with Syed Hashimi on .NET templating.
Yep.
So we now have this .NET CLI with the .NET New experience. Before that, there was a Yeoman generator called Yo.NET.
Yep.
This was an open source project, I believe, under the OmniSharp org on GitHub. And I was contributing to this, trying to make an impact not only in docs, but in that area too, and make a name for myself and, work with people in other parts of the country who I otherwise wouldn't have a chance to work with.
Yep.
But it was cool how all of that ended up getting me to where I am today.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you bring up, like, it's one of those, it's very interesting when, like, I can think of a similar thing where when I started to have more and more like docs on docs.microsoft.com, they had my little avatar in it and was like, oh, okay, well, this is kind of cool. And then people would like find you and be like, hey, is this like you? I'm like, yeah, that's, because I never really had thought about it. I thought it was cool that my avatar was there, but I didn't realize that people actually paid attention to like the by, like the, co-authored by. And I think it is interesting when you talk about technology in general, like how it needs to like go from concept to concept to concept, never really figuring out like how to actually like, because the work's never done, right? So right now things are using docs.microsoft.com, and like you were talking about things like Yeoman, and now we have .NET CLI, and like all the work of all these people kind of just gets deprecated over time. And then the new thing comes, and then that thing gets deprecated and so forth. So I'm always interested in knowing what like the next thing is, right? like one of the things that I saw that one of the things that you worked on when you're on the docs team that I was like, oh, I never really even thought about that was like the sandbox, right? Like the concept of being able to like run snippets of code like inside the browser that actually did stuff, right? Like, do you want to talk a little bit about that work and kind of what was interesting about it for you?
So for folks that aren't aware, Microsoft, outside of the traditional conceptual documentation and reference documentation, there's also this thing called Microsoft Learn. And it's really a gamified learning platform where you can interact with a product, typically Azure or something Azure related, .NET related, in the browser without the need to install tools. It's all based on the Azure Cloud Shell. So it spins up the Cloud Shell in the browser, gives you a VS Code-like browser experience. It's just the Azure Cloud Shell editor. And I partnered up with Cam Soper, who I know you've had on your show, and we decided we're both bored with writing conceptual docs all the time. Let's do something cool for a change. Like let's think outside of the box. What we ended up doing was really blazing that trail for the content development organization and showing them that you can really create this frictionless learning experience in the browser.
Yep.
No need for the customer to install anything. They really just want to kick the tires on, let's say, ASP.NET Core and some Azure service.
Yep.
Like they want to connect to a Azure SQL database from this web API. Well, that's something we were able to prove out, and we went on to create, I think it was like 9 Microsoft Learn modules. Module basically being a course.
Yep. Yeah, it's about that. Like, I love how you say that frictionless learning, right? Like, everybody learns differently, but the thing that's really, really important is that no matter where people are in their learning journey, like, things are easily accessible. Like, something as simple as like, maybe I don't have a machine that can, run Visual Studio or Eclipse or IntelliJ or ReSharper. Or maybe you can't run those things. Maybe like it's a Chromebook. Maybe all it can really run is the browser and maybe like one other thing. And if I had that one other thing running, like the browser doesn't work, whatever, right? So being able to do some of this learning in the browser is really impactful. Like, GitHub.dev or some of the great, Visual Studio code extensions that are coming out that allow you to just build things in the browser, which are pretty high fidelity, right? Like this is the new way of people doing things.
Right. So if you think about what it's like to be in the shoes of a content developer at Microsoft, the reality is it's not often that you hear about the good things.
Sure.
So let's go back to the conceptual documentation we were talking about for ASP.NET Core. You're a .NET developer building a web app, and you need to know how to securely store secrets in your application. You could write the most awesome doc that explains that, and chances are you're only going to hear about the problems.
Sure.
You're never going to receive praise. What was cool about Microsoft Learn, it was quite the opposite. We had customer verbatims coming in almost weekly from students and early career developers saying, thank you for providing this platform for me. I couldn't have used Azure any other way, just to try it out.
Yep.
I don't have access to a credit card or some other restriction that exists. So it was really rewarding to know that we were reaching that audience that we probably weren't reaching any other way.
Yeah, and I think that's how like bringing impact to like underrepresented folks work too, right? Like, something as simple as, hey, maybe I don't have access to Azure, because Azure, unfortunately, like a lot of the other cloud providers, you need like some payment method where, like there's all sorts of free services on all these cloud providers. Don't get me wrong, but like not everything is free, so you can't go in there and just start spinning stuff up because somebody's got to pay for it. So things like barrier to entry, like not being able to just spin up, go to the portal and be able to do things is really impactful for people. So be able to say, okay, here is a sandbox which has some limited access to things in Azure. And from there, you can party on it any way you want, right? Like Google has a similar thing. AWS has a similar thing too. And I think it's really, really important that like all of these different cloud providers, they want you to use their stuff. So they're going to give you as many opportunities to use that stuff as they can, right? But like to actually get access to the whole gamut, you do need to have some more payment process, which is a barrier for folks.
Yeah. And so there's another thing we can touch on here outside of the payment aspect, and that is Scott Hanselman uses this term yak shaving.
Yeah.
If you haven't heard yak shaving before, it's all of the ceremony you're subjected to just to complete that one task you came there to complete. What Microsoft Learn did for the student is they removed that ceremony. We took care of the yak shaving for you. If you wanted to modify a Helm chart, guess what? We had already set up the Kubernetes cluster for you in AKS. Everything was there so that you could come in and just narrow your focus to the thing you came there to learn or do.
Yeah, I think that's something that's very interesting too. And I think we can talk about like .NET 6 and how they're doing that, because I think that's kind of interesting about, removing ceremony. Because as somebody who wants to get started learning something, like I don't want to spend, like one of the things I hate about the JavaScript community, even though I love the JavaScript community, is like everybody's so dependent on like everything takes forever to like get to the point. Like npm install, like even for like an Angular like template is ridiculous, right? And it's great that we're able to like leverage all this great work of all these people. .NET has the same issue with NuGet packages, don't get me wrong, but it's one of those things where you're so dependent on waiting, right? Like I was thinking of, one of my favorite books that I read to my kids is "Oh, the Places You'll Go" by Dr. Seuss, and there's a part of it where it's like, everybody's just waiting for the train to come or whatever, right? And it's true. Like in our lives, especially in tech, like there's a lot of waiting, right? Waiting for things to get done, whether it's technical things like building or npm installs, or waiting for people to make up their mind to like what features they want to ship and what times, right? So like reducing the amount of time to waiting in that developer loop that I always hear people talk about is really important.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, was Dr. Seuss really referring to npm install?
Probably.
The world may never know.
There's a meme in
He
there
was ahead of
somewhere,
his
probably.
time. Yeah. But yeah, something you mentioned, really tightening that inner dev loop. That's actually a big thing that I focus on now in my new role. So let me explain a little bit.
Sure.
So we talked about my experience on the docs team, working on ASP.NET Core. Earlier this year, I moved over to our developer division, where I now work as a program manager on the Azure SDK team. Developer experience is a big thing that we're focused on. My areas of responsibility are far-reaching, so I'm looking at dev experience for Java and .NET SDKs, but I'm also looking at a couple of service SDKs, so Identity and Azure Monitor. And we're looking at everything from what does that developer experience look like inside of your IDE of choice or your editor of choice. We're looking at things like docs, where does the pain exist when you're trying to find that information? And when you do find that information, how long does it take you to go from beginning to end?
Yep.
Can we really shrink or compress that time down to 5 minutes? 5 minutes to, from .NET new to deployed to Azure App Service, let's say.
Yeah, and I think one thing that people might not realize, which I think is probably one of the beauties of a lot of the things that Microsoft has done lately, is like the Azure SDK is all open source as well, right? Because at the end of the day, to go deep into like all of how you control Azure is all through a set of REST services, right? So every mechanism that you use to create, for instance, an app service, whether you're doing it using the Azure CLI or you're using it using the SDK with your programming language of choice, or even if you're doing it in the portal, they're all calls to a web service, right? Or a plethora of web services. So all the SDK is basically is a wrapper for a bunch of REST calls. So again, Scott, like you're still working in open source, right? Like all the work that you're doing is in the open source space, which I think is really awesome to think about.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things that drew me to this new team was the fact that I could continue to work with customers in open source on GitHub. but I could also continue to work with a lot of the same folks I was already working with
Yep.
in .NET open source. So the Azure SDK for .NET is open source, but guess what? We are constantly talking to people on the .NET team that I came from about how can we partner to improve things here.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I like a lot about things like the Azure SDK is that you kind of own the entire, like you own your mistakes, you own your things. And one thing that I've used the Azure SDK for a long time is that this isn't like they just don't ship the SDK and then when new products roll out, they just add those products to the SDK. Like there was a large amount of work that was done to basically make the SDK more accessible for folks as well.
Yeah, in the chat it
says there's an echo.
says there's an echo.
All right, let me try to figure that out. Anyway, you want to keep talking?
Yeah, so one thing I'd like to take a step back because this is a common source of confusion. When customers hear the term SDK, they immediately think of the traditional software development kit that you would install on your development machine. Really what I mean in this case by SDK is packages. So think of when I say Azure SDK for .NET, that is a collection of NuGet packages. If we equate that to the Python ecosystem, that would be a collection of PyPI packages. Or with JavaScript, that would be NPM packages. Looking at the chat, it says now it's gone. Not sure what you tweaked over there, but we're good. So wanted to kind of clarify what we mean by Azure SDKs there.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think one thing that's also very interesting is it's just one way to go about doing things. Like if you're a programmer, you have all these tools, right? I think as we introduce more and more tools that allow people to do what they want, it's only going to make the developer experience better. And that's one of the things that I love about my career ever since I had that conversation with you at Build, is that I focus extensively on like how can I make the developer experience better, right? Whether that's through building content or docs or rambling about things on the internet. Like it's all about, making that platform for the next generation to be as stable as possible, right? Like we use the canonical standing on the shoulders of giants, right? But shoulders are pretty unstable to stand on. So like you want to build this platform for people to be able to stand on that's strong enough for them to do whatever they want on it without any concerns.
Yep. It's really about empathy for the customer. Think back to when you weren't at Microsoft and you were that customer trying to use the product. What really sucked as a customer? Those are the things that I'm trying to think of and improve. Thinking back again to my time in docs, it was really the same motivation. What sucks in docs? That's what I was trying to fix. Same thing on the SDK team.
Yeah, it's funny that you say it's like, oh, what sucks in docs, right? Like, I think, and this is one of my the things I love and also the things I hate about open source, right? Is that open source is open for contribution, but that contribution isn't always positive. And contribution comes in all sorts of different ways, right? Like I tell people, opening an issue is contribution. It might not be the, I guess, the most appreciated form of contribution, but it is, right? Because as somebody who owns open source repositories that people actually kind of use, like I don't know all of the use cases. I know the use cases that people report to me saying they don't work, right? And I think that's really, really important to call out is that, whether it's writing code specifically, whether it's documentation, whether it's actually contributing via discussions or issues or pull requests, like having the conversation at all levels is contribution. And I think it's really, really important to call out is that not everybody speaks the same language too. Like where you are in your career, where you're from in the world, like everybody speaks differently about things. And it's really, really important to make sure that you're open to contribution if that's something that you want to do. Look, if you want to have an open source project that nobody contributes to, that's great. There's a lot of them, and that's okay. But if you do want contribution, if you do want to make your product better or your program or whatever you want to call it better, it's about making sure that platform is as strong as it could be and the barrier is as low as possible.
Yeah. One of the common problems I see in open source is you'll find a wildly popular library. Let's look at something like AutoMapper from Jimmy Bogard in the .NET ecosystem. I cannot imagine what it would be like to try and maintain a project that is that popular. At some point, you're going to feel this sense of guilt, like you owe the community your time to maintain that project. And I think that's where burnout starts to creep in. So at some point, you need to kind of just take a firm stance as an open source maintainer and say, this is the time I'm going to volunteer or commit to this project. And then I'm taking a step back. I don't owe anybody anything. I'm not, this isn't generating income for me. I'm doing this to solve my own problems or potentially out of the kindness of my own heart.
Yeah, I say this exact thing, right? Like if somebody opens up an issue for something like Presence Lite, which is a tool that I built a year ago that for whatever reason people actually use a lot. I welcome your PR, but don't get mad at me if I reject it. Because one thing is that I tell people like you want to contribute, but you're not a maintainer. So you come into my project, you bring this great feature, you do a PR, but I don't know how to maintain that code. Maybe because I'm not good enough, maybe because you're using concepts I'm not familiar with, or maybe because I'm not as great a developer as you are. And that's okay.
Yeah.
But it's about like I need to maintain it going forward because you're not going to all of a sudden be one of my co-maintainers. And that happens too. Like some people fall in love with a project and they're like, I want this to be a part of my thing too. But mostly, unless you have a large project, there's one, maybe two maintainers. Like one of the things that I do is I work on the marketing committee for the .NET Foundation. We have this program called Project Spotlight, which showcases community projects that the .NET Foundation sponsors. And when I talk with people, like I'm not talking to like 6 or 7 contributors. I'm talking to usually one person who's like the main contributor of the program.
Yeah, I think of it like this. So imagine you're a small business that builds decks on people's homes. That's all you do is you build decks. And then someone comes along and they say, "Hey, I'm going to donate an exhaust system to you, a muffler." And you, as the small business owner, are asking yourself, "What in the hell am I going to do with an exhaust system? I run a deck company." Now, translate that to the open source world. Sometimes that's what happens. The open source maintainer has a vision for the project, and sometimes he will be riddled with PRs that just don't align to that vision. They deviate from the path that he wants to take with the project. In cases like that, my opinion is it's okay for the maintainer to just reject the request and explain, here is my vision. And hopefully that vision is documented somewhere and he or she can just point to that and say, here's what we're trying to do with this project. Again, I'm not looking for car parts. I'm looking for lumber.
I think that's a great analogy. I think a lot of people are in tech in general are guilty of this, which is like scope creep, right? Even for like your small open source project, like maybe you have something and then somebody comes in and says, oh, I love this. Like I'll use Presence Lite as an example just because I have context there and I like to talk about things that I've done because I have an ego. But like what Presence Lite does is it takes your Microsoft Teams presence and it sends it to smart lights. Like I have some LifeX lights, I have Philips Hue, I have Yee Light, and whatever, right? So people will occasionally reach out and says, hey, this is the smart light that I bought, off of Amazon and it doesn't work with that. And I say, I'm sorry, but I don't own that light and I'm not going to go and buy that light for you, right? And I think, it's about being kind with people who they just want their thing to work. And I think that people in tech are very guilty of that. And it's okay. Like this thing doesn't work for my use case, so I want it to either work for my use case or I'm not going to use it. And it's like, there's also like this, I don't want to use your platform anymore because you don't satisfy my use case. And it's like, that's cool, I guess, but I'm really doing it for myself, not just for you.
Yeah. I think another thing that comes into play here is support. So you think about, let's look at some of the major control vendors in the .NET ecosystem. Telerik is one that comes to mind. There's a reason why customers pay them, for these contracts, for these licenses. It's mostly about support. If I deploy this application to production and it's using your grid control and something goes terribly wrong, I should be able to pick up the phone and get support almost immediately. The same does not apply in the open source world. You're using somebody's project, somebody's code for free. And as I mentioned earlier, they do not owe you anything. But the gray area here, something I have started to wonder about is how does that change with this new GitHub sponsorship model that has been rolled out? Does that then imply that because you are sponsoring that developer, they should be able to just call you up at 3 a.m. and say, hey, my app's broken, wake up and fix it?
I think the biggest thing is, I was thinking about sponsors as well. Like, we had a conversation with Kat Cosgrove last week, and we were talking about maintainership and how you contribute to, if you're a big company and you use open source, like what does that actually mean, right? And this is an interesting conversation that I've started to think about. It's like, you're giving the opportunity to financially support open source projects that you know and love, which is great. But at the end of the day, like, no amount, and that's probably not fair because I imagine a lot of projects get a lot of sponsorships. But, for the most part, you are never going to put somebody in a position where they can quit their day job because they have enough sponsorship. So where is that happy medium between, hey, I donated $5 for this person's project, and now all of a sudden, like, I am financially motivated to tell them to do things that I want to do, right? It's a slippery slope. And one of the things that I think is really important is that unless you work for a company that's, like a Microsoft or a Google or any other big company, and you do a lot of work in the open, these projects are either small companies that are trying to get started. They're organizations of people that are trying to, move a developer community forward, or they're individual people who love tech. And you have to remember that predominantly open source is people who don't make money off of it. And we need to be very cognizant of that whenever we feel like we're being slighted as a user. I'm very guilty of it too. Like, I'll find an NPM package or a NuGet package and I'm like, oh, this is exactly what I want. And I'll spend all of the time, like all of the ceremony, the pomp and circumstance of being able to use it. And then it doesn't work for my use case. And I'm like, okay, delete, never using this project again. I could write an issue and say, hey, this doesn't work for me or whatever. I usually don't because I don't want to weigh people down with my nonsense. But like, there's all these options in tech, and it's our jobs as developers to find like what option is going to work for us. And but it's not our job to tell people how to do the things they want to do in most cases.
Yeah, I agree 100%. There was something you said there and I lost my train of thought, but I
tend to talk a lot, so I'm sorry about that.
It'll come to me eventually. Keep talking.
I have no problem continuing talking. I know we're running it towards the end of our time, so I'll try to say words that trigger what you were thinking. So like, to get back to this conversation about like, what does it mean to be an open source maintainer, right? Like, we were talking a bit earlier about like the pain in tech in general. And you made an interesting comment a bit ago about how most of the feedback that you get is negative and you wait for the positive, right? So like, for instance, when you're on the docs team, right? I would imagine most of the issues that were opened for docs.microsoft.com / whatever technology, most of them were, this doc is incorrect, this word is spelled wrong, this code snippet doesn't work, right? It was never like, this is the greatest thing ever, thank you so much for your time and effort, right? Because good, bad, or indifferent, it's not called feedback in GitHub. It's called issues. So yeah, and I was thinking the other day, it's like, where do we bring positive comments to open source? Like, how do we do that?
I would like to see the term issue change, replace it with something like opportunity. Put more of a positive spin on it. A lot of the issues that would come through on the docs team were, hey, this doc is 2 versions behind what the latest product is, or hey, I bought this toy to do a somersault, but it only does cartwheels. It's those edge cases where the customer's trying to get the product to do something that it was never intended to do. And I would say those are the bulk of the issues that would come through. It was less about, hey, this spelling issue exists, because as the team matured, they brought in tooling to address things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I like your thought about like changing the name of issues. I think that would be a huge thing, like cataclysmic change across open source. If GitHub is canonical with open source now, like I know there are other platforms out there that they do like, project, our code repository tracking and all of that. Like GitLab is a great example. But I think one of the things that's interesting is that we now have this negative phrase that's used to really mean something else, right? I think it's issues because predominantly it was used as creating bugs. What I do like, to quote your team foundation server or, Azure DevOps now, is that they use the term work item, right? And you can specify in a work item, it's a task or a bug, right? That's more from a project management perspective, but I really like that approach. Because if things are bugs, like they should be flagged as bugs, but not every single thing that needs to get done is a bug, right? Like,
yeah. And we see the same sort of negative sentiment with things like git blame. Like, so let me look at the blame for this file. Who can I, place the blame on for making this change on this line? I think, again, we need to be, as a community, more inclusive and cautious with the terminology that we're using. Particularly with newcomers to the industry, if they're coming into an ecosystem of tools where things like issues and blame are used, it's going to be less welcoming to them.
I mean, that's a really good point, right? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in the last few years about changing a lot of phrases in tech, right? Because of a lot of reasons. They're not inclusive, they're not appropriate in the current world that we live in. And I think that there is something to say, not to compare any of that with, we shouldn't call it issues anymore, but there is an opportunity maybe to change more negative phrases in tech to something that's a bit more positive, because the goal is to enable people to solve problems with technology. It's not about anything else other than that. And maybe we're rabbit holing too deep. Maybe people don't care that it's called issues. I always just think it's interesting because, the phrase "go open an issue" is now canonical with like, I have a problem, right? But there's never like, oh, I have positive feedback. Are you going to go to Twitter and talk about how great it is? Twitter has like a 6-minute life cycle. So like you tweet and then it goes away forever, unless it goes viral and then it's around for 5 minutes instead. But I mean, I think there's definitely something to say about, and I think maybe that's what discussions is supposed to be for, like having conversations in that space that's not related directly to, hey, this code doesn't work. But I don't know if discussions is used in that way specifically. I think it's more for like, strategy and moving forward of a particular repository or program. But I think there is opportunity for us to, like git blame is a great example. Does it need to be called blame? I mean, yes, it is blaming, but it could be called something else. It could be called git difference or something like that.
Yeah.
Even though git diff is also a thing. I think the thing is they ran out of good names, so they're like, well, blame works.
Yeah. And we're all programmers. We're terrible at naming things. That's just the way it is. We're not paid to name things. We're paid to solve problems.
To be fair, I work in marketing, and we're also not very good at naming things. So I think naming things is just hard in general because there's a lot of things to consider, right? Like, are there other things in the market that have similar names? Is it going to cause confusion with other versions of things inside of your own organization? Is it going to be generally confusing because the name doesn't directly align with what the thing does, right? Like, these are things you need to consider. And, as like, these teams that name things, they're not huge, and they're not like the smart, and no offense, but they don't know everything, right? So,
Right.
But what does know everything? Like the hive mind of like millions of people seeing something like, oh, that's a terrible name, right? Like, I know of a few examples, and I think you probably know a few as well. It's like the second the name was released, you're like, oh, that's a terrible name. Oh, well.
Yeah. So, I encountered this just yesterday. I was having a discussion about this, so I'll bring it up. But you look at product names like Azure DevOps. If someone thought, great name, right? The problem is then community members and internal folks abbreviate that to ADO. And all of a sudden, there's this ambiguity. Well, which ADO are we referring to? Is it ADO.net, the data access technology, or is it truly Azure DevOps? The same problem existed in content development, where there was this minimal viable content writing model that was rolled out, and MVC was used everywhere. So on the ASP.NET team, when we'd see the term MVC, we naturally assumed that it was model view controller, the programming paradigm in ASP.NET, and not this writing model. So I think we going back to again what we were saying before, the terminology matters. Be careful with things like acronyms. Make sure when you're using a term that it isn't inadvertently excluding some sector of the user base.
Yeah, I mean, that's spot on. I think it's the responsibility of kind of the collective to look out for opportunities where we could be introducing biases that we fall victim to. Like, I deal with this all the time in my personal life. I deal with it all the time in my work life about like, I have all these biases, and no one is going to convince me that I don't have one because I know I have one. And it's very, very challenging for me to step aside them, but it's one of the things that I think as we grow and as society grows, we have to do a better job acknowledging our biases and kind of finding ways to pivot around them. Cool. I know that we're running out of time, and I wanted to, as we wrap up, I want to thank you, Scott, for coming on and chatting with me. Like, it's always nice to see you and chat with you. We don't do it as much anymore because I don't work at Microsoft, but it's always great to hear what you're doing and all the great things. As we wrap up, I like to ask my guests, as if they can think of one word that describes open source and technology in general, like, what would that word be to you?
Community. Without community, none of it works. You need that network of people thinking in different ways to create a polished product that works for everybody.
I've heard community a lot, and whenever I think of open source, I think of community as well. So it's a great one. So again, thank you, Scott, so much for joining. For folks that may not know who Scott is, it's Scott_Addie at Twitter. We'll when we post this out, we'll be sure to share it out his Twitter handle and all that other great stuff. So Scott, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for
having me.
Awesome. And thanks for everybody tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next time on Coffee and Open Source. Take care.